The stagecoach groaned to a halt, its axles sighing a final, dusty complaint for Eliza Monroe. The sound was not one of relief, but of a clock striking an hour too late. The sun, a fat, orange eye, was already bleeding into the western horizon, setting the sparse plains ablaze with a light that offered no warmth. This was Dustwater. It looked precisely as it sounded. A single, wide street, paved with nothing but dirt and indifference, was flanked by buildings of sun-bleached wood that seemed to lean on one another for support, weary from the constant assault of the wind. Eliza gathered her small valise and descended, her bones aching with the memory of every rut and rock between Kansas and this forgotten edge of the world. The driver, a man whose face was a roadmap of hard miles, tipped his hat without a word and began unhitching the tired horses. She had asked him an hour back if they would make it to the Double Bar Ranch before nightfall. He had given her a look that was not unkind, merely honest, and said the stage stopped in Dustwater and went no further. The Double Bar was another 10 miles out, a journey to be made in the light of day, not in the gathering dark. Now, standing in the middle of the street, Eliza felt the vastness of the land press in on her. The wind whispered through the slats of the buildings, a lonely, mournful sound that seemed to pull the heat right out of her body. She was a solitary figure in a landscape that did not care for solitary things. Hope, which had been her steadfast companion for so many weeks, had dwindled to a tiny, flickering ember. She had to find a place to stay the night. Her boots kicked up small puffs of ochre dust as she walked toward the most promising structure, a 2-story building with a sign that read Caldwell Boarding House in letters that had once been black but were now a streaky gray. Curtains, starched and white, were visible in the windows, suggesting a degree of order and propriety she desperately craved. She climbed the 3 wooden steps to the porch and knocked on the door, the sound startlingly loud in the quiet air. The door opened a moment later, and a woman stood there, framed by the dim light of the hallway. She was tall and thin, her hair pulled back so tightly that it seemed to be stretching the skin of her face. Her dress was a severe, dark color, and her eyes, small and sharp, took in Eliza from head to toe in a single, swift appraisal. The woman's lips were a thin, unforgiving line. Eliza cleared her throat, forcing a smile she did not feel. "Good evening," she said. "I am looking for a room, just for the night." The woman, Mrs. Caldwell, did not move. Her gaze lingered on Eliza's simple traveling dress, on the valise clutched in her hand, and on the faint wedding band she still wore on her finger. "Are you alone?" she asked, her voice as crisp and dry as autumn leaves. "Yes, I am," Eliza replied. "My journey was delayed. I have a position waiting for me at the Double Bar Ranch, and I must wait until morning to travel there." "Traveling alone," Mrs. Caldwell repeated, the words not a question but a verdict. She made a small, disapproving sound in the back of her throat. "A woman of your age, with no husband or family to see her to her destination. It is not proper." Eliza felt a familiar heat rise in her cheeks. "I am a widow, madam. My husband died in the war. I am making my own way, as I must." Mrs. Caldwell's expression did not soften. It was, if anything, colder than before. "This is a respectable establishment," she announced. "We have a reputation to maintain. We do not have rooms for single women traveling without escort. It invites gossip. It invites trouble." The door began to close. "Please," Eliza said, a note of desperation creeping into her voice. "I have money. I will be no trouble at all. I simply need a safe place to rest until morning." The door shut with a solid, final thud. The latch clicked into place. Eliza stood on the porch, staring at the unyielding wood, the woman's judgment echoing in her ears. It was a judgment she had faced before, in other towns, from other faces. A woman alone was a thing to be suspected, a problem to be solved, or a temptation to be condemned. She was a loose thread in the tightly woven fabric of society, and people did not like loose threads. She turned and walked back down the steps, her shoulders slumping. The sun had now slipped completely below the horizon, and the world was painted in shades of purple and deep blue. The air grew colder, the wind sharper. It bit at her exposed cheeks, and found its way through the thin fabric of her coat. The sounds of the town were changing. From a saloon down the street, she could hear the tinny notes of a poorly played piano and the eruption of coarse male laughter. As she walked past, the doors swung open, spilling a parallelogram of yellow light and noise onto the street. A few men on the saloon's porch stopped talking and watched her pass. Their eyes were not like Mrs. Caldwell's. They were not cold with judgment, but hot with a speculative, animal curiosity that made her feel even more vulnerable. She lowered her head and walked faster, her heart thumping against her ribs. Dustwater was closing in on itself for the night. Lights appeared in a few windows, small squares of warmth in the deepening gloom. But they were other people's lights, other people's homes. They were not for her. She had a few dollars in her purse, enough for a meal, perhaps enough to persuade a stable owner to let her sleep in the hay. But the thought of it sent a shiver of fear and humiliation through her. She was a teacher, a respectable woman, a widow of a soldier who had given his life for his country. She was not meant to sleep in a barn like an animal. Her stomach rumbled, a hollow ache that mirrored the emptiness inside her. She saw a small, single-story building with a hand-painted sign that read, Murphy's Eatery. A faint, greasy light glowed in its window. It did not look inviting, but it looked quiet. It was a port in the storm. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. The air was thick with the smell of stale coffee, fried bacon, and wood smoke. The room was small and nearly empty. A few wooden tables were scattered across the floor. A woman with tired, kind eyes and gray-streaked hair was wiping down the counter. She looked up as Eliza entered and offered a weary smile. "Good evening," she said, "just closing up, but I can get you a cup of coffee if you like." "Thank you," Eliza said, her voice barely a whisper. "That would be very welcome." As her eyes adjusted to the dim light, she noticed she was not the only customer. In a corner booth, sitting with his back to the wall, was a man. He sat perfectly still, a half-empty mug of coffee resting between his large, weathered hands. He did not look up when she entered. He seemed to be a part of the shadows in the corner, a man made of stillness and silence. He was dressed in plain, durable clothes, a dark coat hanging on a peg beside him. His face, what she could see of it in profile, was stark. All angles and planes, as if carved from a piece of hard wood. A thick, dark beard covered his jaw, but it could not hide the profound weariness etched around his eyes. He seemed to be looking at something far beyond the walls of the small diner. Eliza sat at a table as far from the man as she could, feeling the need to remain inconspicuous. The woman, Mrs. Murphy, brought her a steaming mug of coffee. It was bitter and weak, but it was hot, and Eliza wrapped her cold hands around it, grateful for the simple comfort. "You look like you have had a long journey, Mrs. Murphy said gently, her voice full of a sympathy that made Eliza's throat tighten. "I have," Eliza admitted, "and it seems it is not over yet. I was meant to get to the double bar, but the stage was late." "Ah, Tom Harlan's place," Mrs. Murphy said, a flicker of something unreadable in her eyes. "It is a long way to be walking in the dark." Eliza looked down at her coffee. "The boarding house would not give me a room." "Mrs. Murphy sighed, a long, tired sound. "That would be Mrs. Caldwell. She is more concerned with what she calls Christian decency than with Christian charity." "I am sorry, child. I wish I had a place for you, but it is just me and my husband in 2 small rooms out back." Eliza nodded, trying to fight back the sting of tears. She would not cry. She had not cried when she had buried her husband. And she would not cry now over the cruelty of a stranger. "I understand," she said. "Thank you for the coffee." She drank it slowly, making it last, trying to gather her thoughts and form a plan. But her mind was as empty and desolate as the plains outside. There was no plan. There was only the cold, the dark, and the long hours until morning. "Mrs. Murphy began to sweep the floor, the rhythmic scrape of the broom a countdown to the moment Eliza would have to leave. The man in the corner had not moved. He seemed less a customer than a fixture of the room, permanent and unchanging. Finally, Mrs. Murphy leaned her broom against the wall and began to turn down the lamps. "I am sorry, dear," she said softly. "I have to lock up now." "Of course," Eliza said, standing on shaky legs. She placed a coin on the table and pulled her shawl tightly around her shoulders, bracing herself for the cold. She walked to the door, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. This was it. This was the moment she had been dreading. "Wait." The voice came from the corner. It was low and rough, as if it was not used often. Eliza turned. The silent man was on his feet. He was taller than she had thought, broad-shouldered and lean. He moved with a slow, deliberate grace, like an animal that conserves its energy. He walked toward her, stopping a few feet away. His eyes, she saw now, were a pale, washed-out blue, the color of a winter sky. They held a deep, settled sadness that resonated with her own. He looked at her, then at Mrs. Murphy, who was watching them with a worried expression. "What is the trouble?" he asked, his gaze returning to Eliza. "She is a traveler, Mrs." Murphy answered for her. "Late for her position, Mrs." Caldwell turned her away. "She has no place to sleep tonight." The man's eyes searched Eliza's face, not with pity, but with a quiet, solemn understanding. He seemed to see all of her fear and exhaustion in a single glance. Eliza found her voice. "It is true," she said simply. "I do not have a place to sleep." The man was silent for a long moment. The only sound, the ticking of a clock on the wall and the sigh of the wind outside. Eliza expected him to turn away, to offer a word of useless sympathy and then leave her to her fate. Instead, he gave a short, almost imperceptible nod. "Come with me," he said. A jolt of fear went through her. Go with a stranger. A man she had just met in a desolate town at the edge of nowhere. Every warning she had ever been given screamed in her mind. But then she looked into his eyes again. There was no ill intent there. There was only that vast, quiet sorrow. And something else. Something she could not name. It was not kindness. Not exactly. It was something more basic. A simple acknowledgement of her humanity, of her suffering. It was a look that said he, too, knew what it was to be alone in the cold. She looked at Mrs. Murphy, who gave her a small, hesitant nod of encouragement. "Isaiah Doone is a quiet man," the older woman whispered. "But he is a good one. You will be safe." Eliza made her decision. She had no other choice. She nodded at the man. He turned without another word and opened the door, holding it for her. She stepped out into the night, and he followed, pulling the door shut behind them. They walked in silence. He led her away from the main street, away from the faint lights of the town, toward the vast, dark expanse of the prairie. A small cabin stood there, a dark shape against the star-dusted sky. It seemed to be the last outpost of civilization before the wilderness took over completely. He did not ask her name, and she did not ask his. The silence between them was not awkward. It was a shared space, heavy with all the things they did not need to say. He unlocked the cabin door and pushed it open, stepping aside to let her enter inside. It was a single room, even sparser than she had imagined. A small table and 2 chairs stood in the center. A stone fireplace was cold and dark. In the far corner was a bed, a simple wooden frame with a thin mattress and a neatly folded wool blanket. The air smelled of pine smoke, old leather, and a profound, unshakable loneliness. Eliza stood just inside the doorway, clutching her valise, her body tense. This was the moment of truth. The man walked past her to the bed. He did not look at her. He simply reached down and took a corner of the worn blanket, pulling it back to reveal a clean, patched sheet underneath. He turned his head then, his pale eyes meeting hers in the dim moonlight that streamed through the single window. His voice, when he spoke, was a low murmur, a statement of simple fact in the quiet room. Right here. Eliza woke to a world of gray light and aching bones. For a moment, she did not know where she was. The ceiling was low, made of rough-hewn timbers, and the air was cold enough to see her breath. Then it came back to her, the closed door of the boarding house, the lonely diner, the silent man. Isaiah Doone. She was in his cabin, in his bed. She sat up quickly, her heart beginning to pound, and saw him. He was asleep in a chair pulled close to the dead fireplace, a different, coarser blanket wrapped around his large frame. He had not taken the bed. He had given it to her and taken the floor for himself. The knot of fear in her stomach loosened, replaced by a wave of profound, weary gratitude. She slipped out of the bed, her stockinged feet silent on the cold floorboards. The single room seemed even smaller and starker in the morning light. It was a place stripped down to a man's basic needs: a bed, a table, a fireplace. Yet, as her eyes adjusted, she began to see the ghosts. In one corner, nearly hidden in the shadows, was a small rocking chair. It was not a man's chair. It was delicately made, and a thick layer of dust lay upon it like a shroud. Near it, on a low shelf, sat a pair of tiny, button-up shoes. They were worn at the toes and heels, the leather scuffed from the explorations of a child. Eliza reached out a trembling hand and touched the soft leather. They were a little girl's shoes. The sight of them was a physical blow. This was not just a cabin. It was a tomb of memory. The silence in this room was not empty. It was filled with the echoes of a life that was no longer there. The man's deep sadness, which she had felt so keenly the night before, now had a shape and a name. He had lost not just a wife, but a child. The floorboards creaked under his weight as he stirred. Isaiah opened his eyes and looked at her, his gaze clear and direct. There was no surprise, no awkwardness. He simply unfolded himself from the chair, his joints popping in the cold air. "There is a well out back," he said, his voice a low rumble, "and coffee in the tin by the hearth." He moved to the fireplace, his back to her, and began to build a fire with an economy of motion that spoke of long practice. He did not ask how she had slept. He did not comment on her presence. He simply stated the facts of the morning. Eliza, feeling the need to make herself useful, to claim some small space in this silent world, found the tin and the coffee pot. She went out into the biting morning air and worked the pump of the well, the iron handle cold and unforgiving in her hands. The water came up in a rush, clean and shockingly cold. When she returned, a small fire was crackling in the hearth, chasing the worst of the chill from the room. They made the coffee in silence, moving around each other in the confined space with a careful, unspoken courtesy. He handed her a tin mug, and they sat at the small table, the rising steam from their coffee the only thing that moved between them. "My name is Eliza Monroe," she said, the words feeling loud in the quiet. He nodded once. Isaiah Doone. He did not ask what her plans were, but the question hung in the air. She knew she could not stay. He had offered a roof for a night, an act of charity, not an invitation. Her mind turned to the Double Bar Ranch, to the position she had traveled so far to secure, but the thought of it was a bitter pill. Tom Harlan, the owner of the ranch, was a man she had known in Kansas. He had been a widower, a man of some standing, who had at first shown her a respectable courtship, but his attentions had quickly turned sour, becoming possessive and demanding. When she had politely but firmly refused his proposal of marriage, His pride had been wounded, and his courtship had turned into a quiet, persistent harassment that had made her life unbearable. She had left Kansas to escape him, and the cruel irony of finding him here, at the end of her long journey, was almost too much to bear. "I cannot go to the double bar," she said, her voice low. "I did not realize who the owner was until I was well on my way. I cannot work for that man." Isaiah looked at her, his expression unreadable. He did not press for details. He seemed to accept her statement as an immutable fact. "What will you do?" he asked. "I do not know," she confessed, the admission costing her a great deal of her remaining pride. She looked around the small, bare cabin. "But I cannot be a burden to you. Mr. Doone, I am grateful for your kindness, but I will find my own way this morning." He took a long drink of his coffee, his gaze fixed on the fire. "I used to run a freight line," he said, his voice distant, as if he were speaking of another man's life. "Before the railroad came through and took most of the business, my wife, Sarah, and my little girl, Mary, they would sometimes ride with me on the shorter runs. They liked the air." He paused, and the silence stretched, filled with the crackle of the fire. Eliza held her breath, knowing she was standing on sacred ground. "There is a place east of here, Devil's Canyon," he continued, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "A narrow pass. A storm came up fast, made the road slick with mud. The lead horse shied at a bolt of lightning. The wagon, it went over the edge." He fell silent again. Eliza could see it all in her mind, the screaming horses, the splintering wood, the terrible, final fall. She said nothing. There were no words for a grief that vast. That was the source of his stillness, the reason for the emptiness in his eyes. He was a man who had watched his entire world tumble into an abyss. "I sold the business," he said at last. "I kept this cabin. It is quiet here." He looked at her then, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something other than sorrow in his eyes. It was a shared understanding. He saw in her a fellow survivor, another soul set adrift by a cruel fate. "You are no burden," he said. Later that day, Eliza went to see Mrs. Murphy. The kind woman's face lit up when she saw her. "I was worried for you," she said, bustling around her small eatery. "Mr. Doone was a gentleman," Eliza assured her. "But I must find work. I cannot impose on him." "Mrs. Murphy considered this, wiping her hands on her apron. "You are a seamstress?" she asked, noticing the neat, practical stitches on Eliza's own dress. "I can sew, yes, and I was a teacher before I was married. There is no school in Dustwater." "Mrs." Murphy said with a sad shake of her head. "Not a proper one. Anyway, but there is always mending. The men here are rough on their clothes." "I will put the word out for you. You can work here, in the afternoons when it is quiet." And so a new routine was born. Eliza spent her mornings at Isaiah's cabin. She insisted on earning her keep. She swept the floors, chasing out the dust that was a constant invader from the plains. She learned the quirks of the old stove and began to cook for them. Simple meals of beans and bacon and whatever else she could afford with the few dollars she had. The smell of baking bread, something the cabin had not known for years, began to fill the small space. She was bringing life back into the tomb. In the afternoons, she would walk into town and sit in a corner of Mrs. Murphy's eatery, a growing pile of torn shirts and worn trousers beside her. The men of the town, miners and ranch hands and drifters, would at first look at her with suspicion, but her quiet dignity and the quality of her work soon won them a grudging respect. She earned a few coins each day, enough to buy flour and coffee and salt pork. She was no longer a charity case. She was contributing. She was making her own way. The arrangement she had with Isaiah was unspoken. She would cook and clean, and he would provide the roof over her head. They were like two planets orbiting the same star of shared loneliness, keeping a careful distance, yet held together by a silent gravity. The evenings were the quietest time. After she returned from town and they had eaten their supper, they would sit by the fire. She would do some mending for herself or read from the one book she owned, a well-worn copy of Shakespeare's sonnets. He would sit in his chair, sometimes cleaning a rifle, sometimes carving a small piece of wood, but most often just staring into the flames, lost in a place she could not go. A tentative, fragile intimacy began to grow in that shared silence. It was not built on words, but on small gestures. The way he would leave a pile of chopped firewood by the door for her each morning. The way she would make sure his coffee was hot when he came in from the cold. One evening, reaching for the poker at the same time, their hands brushed. The contact was brief, a fleeting warmth, but it sent a jolt through Eliza. She pulled her hand back as if burned, her cheeks flushing. He did not react, his expression unchanging, but she saw the muscles in his jaw tighten. They were both fighting their own private wars. For Eliza, it was a battle against a lifetime of caution. She was a woman alone, living under the roof of a man who was not her husband. She knew what the Mrs. Caldwells of the world would say about such a thing. She felt a constant, low-level fear of being used, of his kindness being a prelude to something else. She watched him carefully, looking for any sign, any hint of impropriety. But there was none. He treated her with a detached respect that was both a comfort and a source of a strange, new loneliness. For Isaiah, the battle was with his own ghosts. Eliza's presence in his home, the smell of her cooking, the soft rustle of her dress, were all painful reminders of what he had lost. He had walled off his heart years ago, burying it in the canyon with his wife and child. He had learned to exist, not to live, but this woman, with her quiet strength and her gentle, persistent efforts to bring order and warmth to his desolate life, was chipping away at that wall. He felt things he had not allowed himself to feel for years, a flicker of warmth when she smiled, a stab of protectiveness when he saw the exhaustion in her eyes. It frightened him. He felt he had no right to these feelings. He was a man whose failure had cost his family their lives. He did not deserve a second chance at warmth. He did not deserve her. So he kept his distance, wrapping himself in a cloak of silence, punishing himself with the past, even as she was slowly, unknowingly, pulling him back into the present. The delicate piece Eliza had constructed was as fragile as a spider's web, and just as easily torn. The change in dust water was not sudden, like a thunderstorm, but slow and creeping, like a frost. It began with the eyes. When she walked into town for her afternoon mending, the glances that had once been dismissive or grudgingly respectful were now something else. They were sharp and lingering, filled with a prurient curiosity. Women who had previously given her a curt nod now turned their heads as she approached, gathering in tight knots of 2 or 3. Their whispers ceasing the moment she was in earshot, only to resume with renewed vigor the second she had passed. The source of this poison was, as she had suspected it would be, Mrs. Caldwell. Eliza would see her on the porch of the boarding house, a grim-faced general surveying her domain, her words carrying on the wind, sharp and cutting. Eliza never heard the full sentences, only fragments. A man's cabin. No shame. A widow ought to know better. Each fragment was a small stone thrown at her dignity. At first, Eliza tried to ignore it. She held her head a little higher, kept her gaze fixed straight ahead, and focused on the work that waited for her at Mrs. Murphy's. She told herself that the opinions of small-minded people did not matter. She was a woman earning an honest living, paying her way. Her arrangement with Isaiah Doone was one of necessity and decency, a private matter between 2 solitary souls, but the whispers followed her, seeping into the spaces she had thought were safe. One afternoon at the general store, she was waiting to pay for a sack of flour when 2 women came in behind her. They spoke to each other in deliberately loud voices, a performance for her benefit. "Did you hear," one said, "that the Doone fellow is taking in strays? Now I wonder what sort of payment he requires for his charity." The other woman laughed. A short, ugly sound. I imagine it is the sort of payment a woman like that is accustomed to giving. They say she came here to work for Tom Harlan. She must have gotten lost on her way to the saloon. Eliza's back went rigid. Her cheeks burned with a heat that was close to tears. She wanted to turn, to confront them, to tell them they knew nothing of her life, nothing of the quiet, respectful man who gave her his bed and slept by the cold hearth. But she knew it would be useless. Their minds were as closed and barred as Mrs. Caldwell's front door. She paid for her flour without a word, her hands trembling as she took the change, and walked out of the store, their laughter following her down the street. She carried the weight of their judgment back to the cabin. It was a physical thing, a heaviness in her chest and a weariness in her limbs that had nothing to do with the long walk. The cabin, once a sanctuary, now felt like a cage of their making. She looked at the single room, at the bed in the corner, and saw it all through their eyes, a sordid, shameful arrangement. The fear she had been suppressing, the fear of being misunderstood, of being used, came rushing back. Isaiah was not a man who went into town often. He was self-sufficient, preferring the company of the wind and the vast, empty plains to that of other people. He was largely unaware of the tide of gossip that was rising against her. But he was a man who noticed things. He noticed the new tension in her shoulders, the way she no longer hummed quietly to herself as she cooked. He saw the faint, dark circles that had appeared under her eyes, and the way she would sometimes stare into the fire, her mending forgotten in her lap, her expression one of deep, troubled thought. One evening, he returned from checking his traps, a brace of rabbits slung over his shoulder. He found her sitting at the table, not reading or sewing, but just sitting, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. The setting sun cast long shadows across the floor, and in the dim light, she looked small and terribly vulnerable. "What is it?" he asked, his voice softer than usual. She shook her head, forcing a smile that did not reach her eyes. "It is nothing, just tired." "It is not nothing," he said, closing the door and setting the rabbits on the floor. "I see it in you, the town. What are they saying?" The directness of the question broke through her defenses. The words came spilling out, a torrent of humiliation and frustration. She told him about the whispers, the stares, the cruel performance in the general store. As she spoke, she saw a change come over him. His usual stillness dissolved, replaced by a coiled, dangerous energy. The weariness in his eyes was burned away by a cold, hard anger. His hands, resting on the back of a chair, clenched into fists, his knuckles white. When she finished, the cabin was silent. But it was a new kind of silence. It was not the peaceful quiet of two people comfortable in each other's presence. It was the tense, charged silence that precedes a storm. "I will go into town," he said, his voice low and hard as granite. "I will speak to them. I will make them stop." He started for the door, and Eliza jumped to her feet, grabbing his arm. "No, Isaiah, you must not. That will only make it worse. It will confirm everything they think." He stopped, but he did not turn to look at her. His whole body was rigid with a fury she had never seen before. It frightened her, but it also touched a part of her that had felt cold for a very long time. This anger was for her. He was fighting a battle on her behalf. Eliza's voice was firm, though her heart was pounding. "Let them talk. We cannot stop people from being small." He turned then, and the look in his eyes was raw, a pain so deep it was almost terrifying. "But I can stop them from hurting you," he said, the words torn from him, a confession of a feeling he had not yet admitted even to himself. The air between them crackled with the weight of that admission. In 3 short sentences, everything had changed. He was no longer just her protector out of a sense of duty or charity. His concern was personal, profound. And in that moment, Eliza realized that her own feelings had changed as well. She was no longer just grateful for his help. She cared for this broken, silent man, and the thought of his pain was as sharp as her own. He paced the small cabin, his long strides eating up the space, a caged wolf looking for a way out. His anger was a living thing in the room. This is not right. Eliza, what they are doing to you. You do not deserve this. I have faced gossip before, she said quietly. A woman alone is always a target for such things. Then we will not let you be alone, he said, stopping in front of her. We can leave. We can leave Dustwater. We can go west to Oregon or north to the territories. We can find a place where no one knows us, where we can start again. His words were a plea. He was offering her an escape, the only solution he knew. When his world had ended at the bottom of Devil's Canyon, he had run, he had sold his business, left his life behind, and retreated into this solitary existence. His instinct in the face of pain was to flee. For a moment, Eliza was tempted. The thought of a new place, a clean slate, was a powerful lure. She could leave the judgment of Mrs. Caldwell and the whispers of Dustwater behind. She could escape the ghost of Tom Harlan and the bitter end of her journey. It would be so easy to say yes, to let this strong, protective man take her away from it all. But then she thought of her life, a long series of retreats. She had run from the poverty of her childhood by marrying a man she respected but did not truly love. She had run from the grief of his death by taking a position in a new town. She had run from the unwanted attentions of Tom Harlan by coming to this God-forsaken place. Her whole life had been a flight from something. If she ran now, she would be running forever. She looked at Isaiah, at the desperation in his eyes, and she knew that his solution was not for her. It was for him. He wanted to run from the pain of seeing her hurt, just as he had run from his own grief. If she went with him, they would be two fugitives, forever looking over their shoulders, forever defined by the things they had left behind. She reached out and placed a hand on his arm. His muscles were tense beneath her touch. No, she said, her voice soft but unwavering. His face hardened. Why not? There is nothing for you here but scorn. There is nothing for me here but ghosts. Because I am tired of running, she said, her gaze meeting his, holding it, all my life. I have been running away from things. If I run from this, from them, then I am letting them win. I am letting them say that my life, that our arrangement, is something to be ashamed of. And it is not. You have shown me nothing but kindness and respect. Isaiah Doone, there is no shame in this house. She took a breath, her resolve hardening with every word. This is where I will make my stand. I will not be driven out of this town by the petty cruelty of narrow minds. I will live my life with dignity, and I will hold my head high, and I will let them see that their words have no power over me. Isaiah stared at her, his anger slowly receding, replaced by a look of stunned surprise. He had never met a woman like her. He had expected tears, fear, a grateful acceptance of his offer to escape. He had not expected this quiet, fierce strength, this refusal to be broken. She was not asking him to fight her battles for her. She was asking him to stand with her while she fought them herself. A new and different kind of tension settled in the room. It was the tension of a choice made, a line drawn in the dust. He was still wound tight with a protective fury he did not know what to do with. She was calm and resolute, but she knew the days ahead would be hard. They were a unit now, bound together not just by circumstance, but by a shared enemy and a shared purpose. They would face Dustwater together. He did not know how to fight with words and dignity, and she did not know how to fight with fists and fury. But they both knew they would no longer be fighting alone. The week that followed their confrontation was a quiet war. In the cabin, an unspoken alliance had been forged. Isaiah no longer looked at Eliza with the detached kindness of a rescuer, but with a fierce, protective watchfulness. Eliza, in turn, felt her gratitude solidifying into something deeper, a fierce loyalty to the wounded man who had offered her shelter and was now willing to stand with her against the world. But outside the cabin walls, the town's hostility grew. The whispers became more pointed, the stares more insolent. Her mending business dwindled to a trickle. Women who had once brought her their husbands' shirts now crossed the street to avoid her. She was being starved out, frozen out, exiled from the small community she had tried so hard to join. She knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that this slow siege would break them if they did nothing. They could not hide in the cabin forever. Hiding was a form of surrender. Her decision, born in the quiet desperation of a long night spent listening to the wind howl around the eaves, came to her as the sun rose on Saturday morning. It was a terrifying, audacious plan, one that would force the town to look them in the eye. She waited until Isaiah had finished his morning coffee, until the silence in the room felt less like a comfort and more like a retreat. "Tomorrow is Sunday," she said, her voice even and calm, betraying none of the fear that fluttered in her stomach. He looked up from the knife he was sharpening, his pale eyes questioning. "I think we should go to church," she said. The stone he was using to hone the blade stopped its rhythmic scraping. For a long moment, Isaiah said nothing. He stared at her as if she had suggested they try to fly. The church was the very heart of the town she claimed to be at war with. It was the seat of judgment, Mrs. Caldwell's throne room. "Why?" he finally asked, his voice a low growl. "Why would you want to walk into the lion's den?" "Because," she said, leaning forward slightly, her gaze intense. "Lions are bullies. They prey on the weak and the isolated. They lose their power when you are not afraid of them. We have done nothing wrong, Isaiah. Our only crime is surviving in the way we know how. I will not be made to feel ashamed of that. We will go and we will sit in that church, and we will show them that we are not afraid of their whispers or their God." A muscle worked in his jaw. The anger she had seen before was back, but it was mixed with a deep, profound pain. "I have not been inside that church since—" He did not finish the sentence. He did not have to. Since Sarah and Mary died, the church was a monument to his loss, a place filled with the ghosts of a life where he had been a husband and a father, a man who believed in something more than the turning of the seasons and the certainty of grief. "I know," she said softly, her voice losing its defiant edge, becoming gentle. "I know it will be hard, but it is a place you must face, just as I must face them. We cannot let the past, or the present, hold us prisoner in this cabin. We will go together." He looked away from her, his gaze fixed on the small, dust-covered rocking chair in the corner. He was silent for so long that she thought he would refuse. She saw the war raging inside him, the desire to protect her warring with the agony of confronting his own demons. She had asked more of him than she had a right to ask. She had asked him to reopen a wound that had never truly healed. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough, scarred. "I will need to find my coat," he said. The Sunday morning sun was bright and cold, casting sharp, unforgiving shadows on the ground. Eliza had brushed her one good dress until her arms ached, and had pinned her hair up with meticulous care. She was not dressing for God. She was dressing for battle. Her simple, clean attire, her only armor. Isaiah stood by the door, waiting for her. He wore a dark, formal coat she had never seen before. It was the coat of a man who had once had a place in the world, a man who had attended baptisms and town meetings. It fit him awkwardly now, stretching tight across his broad shoulders, a relic from a life that no longer belonged to him. His face was a grim, unreadable mask, but she could see the tension in the set of his jaw, the rigid line of his back. They did not speak as they walked into town. There was nothing left to say. The path from the cabin to the center of Dustwater had never seemed so long. It was a walk across a stage, and they were the sole actors in a drama the whole town was watching. They saw the first sign of it at the edge of town, a curtain twitching in the window of a small house. Then a man chopping wood in his yard stopped, his axe held motionless in midair. his eyes following them. As they reached the main street, the silence was absolute. Conversations on porches ceased. Children who had been playing in the dust stopped and stared, their games forgotten. It was as if a spell had been cast over the entire town. Eliza felt 100 pairs of eyes on her back. Each stare was a physical weight, pressing down on her, trying to make her lower her head. She focused on the steeple of the small, white church at the end of the street, making it her beacon. She could feel Isaiah's presence beside her, a solid wall of silent, furious energy. He walked with his head up, his gaze sweeping over the silent houses and the staring faces, a silent challenge to them all. The churchyard was crowded with families in their Sunday best. As Eliza and Isaiah approached the gate, a wave of silence spread through the crowd. The low hum of conversation died away, replaced by a thick, expectant hush. It was here, in the open, that the hostility was most palpable. She saw Mrs. Caldwell standing on the church steps, her arms crossed, her face a mask of righteous indignation. Her glare was a physical blow, and Eliza felt herself flinch. Then she felt Isaiah move closer to her, his arm brushing against hers, a small, grounding touch that said, "I am here." They walked up the path, through the sea of hostile and curious faces. They did not stop. They did not acknowledge the whispers that had started up now, a low, sibilant hiss like snakes in the grass. They walked up the wooden steps, past Mrs. Caldwell's rigid form, and into the church. The air inside was cool and smelled of old wood, lemon polish, and the faint, sweet scent of hymnals. The room was nearly full, a collection of all the faces that had condemned her without a trial. As they stepped through the doorway, a hush fell over the congregation. The organist, a small, nervous woman, let her fingers falter on the keys, and a discordant note hung in the air. Every head turned, every eye was fixed on them. Eliza's heart was hammering against her ribs so hard she was sure everyone could hear it. For a terrifying second, her courage failed her. She wanted to turn and flee, to run back to the quiet solitude of the cabin. But Isaiah was beside her, his presence a silent promise. She took a breath, steadied herself, and began to walk down the central aisle. She did not choose a seat in the back, in the shadows where they might be less conspicuous. She walked halfway down the aisle and slid into an empty pew. A moment later, Isaiah followed, his large frame filling the space beside her. They sat side by side, staring straight ahead at the simple wooden cross on the altar, two islands in a sea of judgment. The service began. The preacher, a pale, earnest man with a reedy voice, climbed into the pulpit and began to speak of forgiveness and charity, of the dangers of casting the first stone. His words were a hollow, meaningless drone to Eliza. She was acutely aware of every rustle, every cough, every turned head in the pews behind her. She felt stripped bare, her life and her choices laid out for public dissection. Beside her, Isaiah was unnaturally still. He was not listening to the preacher. His gaze was fixed on the stained glass window to his right, a simple depiction of a shepherd holding a lamb. The colored light painted his stark face in hues of blue and gold. Eliza could only guess at what he was seeing. He was not in this church. In this moment, he was lost in the past, sitting in this very pew, perhaps with a small, warm hand in his, a woman's head resting on his shoulder. She could feel the waves of grief coming off him, a cold, desolate tide. He was facing his ghosts, and the battle was costing him everything. She wanted to reach out, to place her hand on his, to offer some small comfort in his terrible isolation. But she did not. This was his fight, just as the one with the town was hers. All they could do was sit together, their shoulders not quite touching, and lend each other their silent, unyielding strength. When the final hymn was sung and the benediction was given, the ordeal was not over. Now they had to leave, to walk the gauntlet again. The congregation rose, and the room was filled with the sound of shuffling feet and low-murmured conversation. No one spoke to them. The people in the pews around them filed out, giving them a wide berth, as if they were contagious. They were the last to stand. They walked back down the aisle, through the empty church, and out the doors. The sunlight that greeted them on the steps was so bright, it was blinding. Eliza blinked, her eyes watering. The churchyard was still full, the congregation lingering, waiting for the final act of the morning's drama. They stood on the top step, poised between the judgment of the church and the uncertain light of the world, and for a moment they were utterly alone. Then Isaiah moved. He turned to her, and in the bright, unfiltered light of the morning, she saw that the deep, settled sorrow in his eyes had been joined by something else, a flicker of life, a spark of defiance. He had walked through the fire of his past and had come out the other side, not healed, but no longer consumed by the flames. He had done it for her. He held out his hand. It was not a question. It was a statement, a declaration made not in the dark confines of the cabin, but here, in the full light of day, before the eyes of the entire town. Eliza looked at his large, calloused hand, a hand that knew the feel of reins and axes and the cold steel of a rifle, and she placed her own hand in it. His fingers closed around hers, strong and warm. It was the first time they had touched with purpose, with intention. It was a touch that sealed their alliance, that acknowledged the unspoken bond that had grown between them. It was a gesture of profound and simple loyalty that said more than words ever could. Hand in hand, they walked down the steps. The whispers followed them, but they had lost their sting. The stares followed them, but they had lost their power. Eliza Monroe and Isaiah Doone walked through the silent, watchful crowd, their heads held high, their clasped hands a silent testament to the fact that they were no longer alone. They walked out of the churchyard and into the light, leaving the shadows and the judgment behind them. Their walk from the church did not magically change the heart of Dustwater, but it did change the terms of the war. They had not been forgiven, but they had been seen. Their silent, united front had transformed them from a source of salacious gossip into an enigma. The town did not know what to make of them, and so, for the most part, it chose to leave them alone. The whispers did not vanish entirely, but they retreated to the shadows. The stares were still there, but they were now tinged with a reluctant respect, the kind afforded to any creature of the plains that proved too tough or too stubborn to die. They had drawn a line in the sand, and no one, not even Mrs. Caldwell, seemed willing to cross it. Then the winter came. It did not arrive gently, but fell upon the plains like a hammer, a sudden, brutal onslaught of iron-gray skies and a wind that had teeth. The first snow was not a soft, picturesque dusting, but a blinding, horizontal blizzard that buried the world in a sea of white. The cabin, once a simple refuge, became their entire universe. The wind shrieked around the corners, a constant, mournful cry, and the snow piled up in great drifts against the door and the single window, sealing them in. Their life narrowed to a simple, repeating rhythm of survival. Each morning, Isaiah would bundle himself in every layer he owned and battle his way to the woodpile, returning caked in snow, his beard stiff with ice, his arms laden with the fuel that kept them alive. Eliza would have hot coffee waiting, her day spent within the four walls of the cabin, a small, domestic world centered on the warmth of the hearth. They moved around each other in the confined space with a practiced, intricate grace, their routines so intertwined that they began to feel like two halves of a single organism. They lived as a husband and wife might, in everything but name and touch, the invisible line between them, the one that separated her side of the room from his, the bed from the chair, remained. But the space between them was shrinking. The shared hardship and forced intimacy was eroding the careful distance they had maintained. It happened in small, fleeting moments that were almost too quick to register. His fingers would brush against hers as he handed her a log for the fire. She would turn from the stove and find him standing closer than she expected, the clean, cold scent of the outdoors still clinging to him. They would look up from their separate tasks at the same moment, their eyes meeting across the room in a glance that held a universe of unspoken understanding. In the long, dark evenings, the cabin became a sanctuary of quiet companionship. The world outside was a howling, white wilderness, but inside, the fire cast a warm, flickering glow on the rough wooden walls. Eliza would sit in her chair, her fingers busy with her mending, the rhythmic pull of the needle a soothing counterpoint to the storm. Isaiah would sit in his, sometimes reading from an old, leather-bound Bible that had belonged to his father. His voice, when he read aloud, was a low, steady rumble that filled the small space, the ancient words of prophets and kings, a strange and comforting presence in the vast, empty landscape. He did not read with any particular piety, but with the steady cadence of a man who knew the stories by heart, a man clinging to the last remnants of a world where words had order and meaning. One night, the storm reached a fever pitch. The wind battered the small cabin with a relentless, physical force, and the snow fell so thick and fast that it seemed the sky itself was collapsing. They had finished their meager supper of salted pork and hard biscuits and were sitting by the fire. The sounds of the blizzard, a constant, deafening roar. The world had been reduced to this single point of light and warmth, this small raft adrift in a sea of frozen chaos. The intensity of the storm seemed to strip away their usual reserve, leaving them exposed, vulnerable. Eliza looked at Isaiah's face in the firelight. The flames carved deep shadows under his cheekbones and in the hollows of his eyes. He was staring into the fire, but for once, she knew he was not lost in the past. He was present, here with her, listening to the storm. "My husband, Daniel," she said, her voice quiet, almost lost in the noise of the wind. "He was a soldier." Isaiah turned his head slowly, his gaze shifting from the fire to her. He did not speak, but his attention was absolute, an invitation for her to continue. He was a farmer before the war, a kind, steady man. He was not built for fighting. I think that is why he went. He felt it was his duty to protect the things he loved: his land, his country, the idea of a peaceful life. She smiled. A sad, faint thing. We were not married long. He wrote me letters. They were not filled with poetry or grand declarations of love. They were about the weather, and the food, and the state of his boots. He told me he missed the smell of the earth after a rain. She paused, her needle still in her lap. When the letter came telling me he had died, it was from a place I had never heard of, in a battle I did not understand. The chaplain wrote that he was a good soldier, that he died bravely, but all I could think of was that he would never smell the rain on the earth again. It was the small things that broke my heart. She looked up at Isaiah, and she saw in his eyes a reflection of her own loss. He understood. He knew that grief was not a grand, theatrical emotion, but a quiet, persistent ache built from 1,000 tiny, missing pieces. It was not a great love story, she admitted, the confession a whisper. I was fond of him, I respected him, but I was young, and my family was poor. It was a good match. After he was gone, the loneliness was a different kind of war. It was quiet and cold, and it went on forever. She had laid her own small, quiet grief at his feet, an offering of trust. Now it was his turn. The fire popped, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. The wind howled, rattling the window frame. "It was my fault," Isaiah said, his voice a raw, broken thing. Eliza frowned. "The accident. But it was a storm. You said—" He shook his head, his gaze turning back to the fire, as if he could not bear to look at her while he spoke his truth. "I was a freight hauler," he said. "It was my job to know the roads, to know the weather. I had a delivery to make. A contract. I was proud. I thought I could outrun any storm. I pushed the team too hard. I knew that pass was dangerous in the rain, but I went anyway. I was thinking of the money, of being home a day early. I was not thinking of them. His voice cracked, and the sound was the breaking of a thing that had been held together by sheer force of will for a very long time. Sarah, she was afraid of lightning. When the storm broke, she wanted to stop, to find shelter, but I told her it was just a squall, that we would be through it in an hour. And Mary, she was singing a little song. She was not afraid of anything. She was sitting next to me on the driver's seat. I can still hear her singing. He closed his eyes, and a single tear traced a path through the grime on his cheek, glistening in the firelight. He did not wipe it away. When the wagon went over, it was so fast, there was just the sound of the thunder, and the horses screaming, and the wood splintering, and then silence. The singing had stopped. That is the sound I hear every night. The silence after the singing stopped. He opened his eyes, and they were pools of raw, bottomless guilt. It was my wagon, my family, my responsibility. I did not keep them safe. He had finally spoken his great sin, the terrible weight he had been carrying alone in the wilderness for years. He was not just a man who had suffered a loss. He was a man who believed he was the cause of it. He had condemned himself to this prison of solitude as a penance for a crime only he believed he had committed. Eliza's heart broke for him, not with pity, but with a wave of overwhelming compassion that swept away all her own fears and hesitations. She saw not a failure, but a good man who had been broken by a cruel and random twist of fate. She moved from her chair, kneeling on the rough floorboards in front of him. She reached out a trembling hand and laid it on his cheek. His beard was rough against her palm. He flinched at her touch, as if he did not deserve it, as if kindness was a thing he had no right to feel. "It was not your fault, Isaiah," she whispered, her voice fierce. "It was a storm. It was a terrible, tragic accident. It was not your fault." He looked at her then, his eyes searching hers, desperate to believe her, to find some release from his self-inflicted torment. In her gaze, he did not see judgment or pity. He saw acceptance. He saw a shared understanding of brokenness. He saw a strength that was willing to stand beside his weakness. He leaned into her touch, his entire body trembling with the release of his long-held confession. The space between them, the last invisible barrier, dissolved in the warm, flickering light of the fire. The storm raged outside, a wild and destructive force. But inside the small cabin, a different kind of storm had broken. She did not know who moved first. She only knew that his face was closer, that his breath was warm against her lips, that the scent of wood smoke and winter and a deep, human sadness filled her senses, and then his lips were on hers. It was not a kiss of passion, of urgent, pent-up desire. It was a kiss of profound and desperate tenderness. It was the meeting of two solitudes, the gentle collision of two souls who had thought themselves permanently broken. It was a promise, made in the heart of the storm, that they no longer had to face the cold alone. It was not the heat of a raging fire, but the slow, steady warmth of embers that had been buried under the snow. Embers that were finally, against all odds, beginning to glow again. The winter broke as suddenly as it had begun. One day the world was a frozen, silent expanse of white. The next, a gentle Chinook wind whispered down from the mountains, and the great thaw began. The snow melted with astonishing speed, running in muddy rivulets down to the plains, and the air filled with the rich, damp smell of awakening earth. For Eliza and Isaiah, it felt like a resurrection. The cabin, which had been their entire world, now felt confining. They began to spend their days outside, breathing in the fresh, clean air, watching the first green shoots of grass push their way through the mud. The kiss they had shared in the heart of the blizzard had changed everything and nothing. The invisible barrier between them was gone, replaced by a quiet, comfortable intimacy. There were no grand declarations, no promises made. Their bond was not a thing of words, but of shared glances, of hands that brushed together as they worked, of the simple, profound comfort of knowing they were no longer alone. The raw guilt in Isaiah's eyes had softened, replaced by a steady, watchful tenderness whenever he looked at her, and the fear in Eliza's heart, the fear of a woman adrift in a hostile world, had been replaced by a quiet, deep-seated sense of peace, for the first time in a very long time. She felt safe. She felt she was home. Their new peace was shattered on a bright, cool afternoon in early spring. Eliza was tending to a small patch of earth she had tilled near the cabin, hoping to plant a few vegetables, when she saw the rider approaching. He was not a drifter or a ranch hand. He was mounted on a magnificent black horse and dressed in expensive, well-tailored clothes. He rode with an air of absolute ownership, as if the land itself belonged to him. As he drew closer, a cold dread, as icy as the winter wind, began to creep up Eliza's spine. She recognized the arrogant set of his shoulders, the confident angle of his hat. The ghost she had run halfway across the country to escape had found her. It was Tom Harlan. Isaiah came out of the cabin, a piece of harness he was mending in his hand. He stood on the small porch, his body relaxed but his eyes narrowed and watchful, taking in the stranger's approach. Harlan reined in his horse a few feet from the cabin, his gaze sweeping over the small, rustic dwelling with a look of undisguised contempt. "You must be Dune," he said, his voice loud and carrying, the voice of a man accustomed to being obeyed. He did not dismount. "I am Tom Harlan. I own the double bar." Isaiah said nothing, his silence a stark contrast to Harlan's booming self-importance. "I want to buy this parcel of land," Harlan continued, getting straight to the point. "This pathetic little plot of yours sits right in the middle of the most direct route from my new freight line to the railhead. I am prepared to offer you a fair price, more than it is worth." "Certainly." He named a figure. It was a respectable sum of money, enough to tempt any man, but Isaiah simply shook his head. "It is not for sale," he said, his voice calm and final. Harlan's easy smile tightened. "Do not be a fool. Dune, this is a generous offer. What use do you have for this land? You are just squatting out here, wasting away. Take the money. Go somewhere else." It was then that he saw Eliza. She had been standing frozen by her small garden patch, half hidden by the corner of the cabin. His eyes widened in genuine surprise, a look that was quickly replaced by a slow, predatory smile. It was a smile she knew all too well, a smile that stripped her bare, that saw her not as a person, but as a possession. "Well, well," he said, his voice dripping with false pleasantry. "Eliza Monroe. I wondered where you had run off to. It seems we are neighbors after all." Eliza felt the blood drain from her face. She could feel Isaiah's gaze shift to her, sensing her fear, but she could not look at him. She was trapped in the force of Harlan's triumphant stare. Harlan's eyes moved from her to Isaiah, and then back again, a cruel understanding dawning on his face. He let out a short, ugly laugh. "So this is what happened to you. I should have known. When you refused my respectable offer of marriage, I never imagined you would stoop so low." His voice rose, turning from condescending to openly contemptuous, a performance for the vast, empty plains. He looked directly at Isaiah, but his words were daggers aimed at her. "It seems I have solved the great mystery of Dustwater," he sneered. "The fallen woman and the town hermit? You must be quite the pair. Tell me, Dune, what does she do to earn her keep in this miserable little shack I can only imagine? She ran from my home, where she would have been a respected wife, to sell her affections for a roof over her head. The insult hung in the clean spring air, vile and poisonous. It was an attack on everything they had built together, on the quiet dignity of their arrangement, on the unspoken tenderness that had grown between them. Eliza felt as if he had struck her. She saw a flicker of movement from the corner of her eye. It was Isaiah. He moved with a speed that was terrifying. In one moment, he was standing on the porch, a picture of stony calm. In the next, he had crossed the muddy ground in 2 long strides and had dragged Tom Harlan from his horse. The larger man, caught completely by surprise, stumbled and fell. Before he could recover, Isaiah hit him. It was not a wild, clumsy blow, but a single, precise, and devastating punch that landed with the sickening crack of bone against bone. Harlan's head snapped back, and he collapsed into the mud, a line of blood trickling from his mouth. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by Harlan's pained groan. Isaiah stood over him, his chest heaving, his hands clenched into fists, his face a mask of cold, pure rage. He looked like an avenging angel, a figure of terrible, righteous fury. The sound of approaching horses broke the spell. 2 of Harlan's ranch hands, who had been waiting for him down the road, came galloping up, rifles in their hands. They saw their employer on the ground and their leader standing over him. A moment later, the town sheriff, a portly man with a perpetually worried expression, arrived. He had clearly been summoned by Harlan for this meeting. "He has gone mad," Harlan spat, pushing himself up on one elbow, his face contorted with pain and fury. "He attacked me without provocation. Arrest him." The sheriff looked from Harlan's bloodied face to Isaiah's grim, unyielding expression. He was a man who knew where his loyalties lay, and they were not with the silent recluse who lived at the edge of town. "Isaiah Doone," he said, his voice trying for an authority it did not possess. "You are under arrest for assault and disturbing the peace." Isaiah did not resist. The fire in him seemed to have died as quickly as it had ignited, leaving behind a cold, grim resignation. He allowed the sheriff to take his arms and bind his wrists. As he was led away, he looked at Eliza, and in his eyes she saw not anger, but a profound, aching sorrow. He had broken his silence, broken his peace, to defend her honor, and now he was paying the price. Eliza stood frozen, watching them lead him away, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. Harlan, helped to his feet by his men, shot her a look of pure, triumphant malice. He had won. He had not gotten the land, but he had gotten his revenge. He had destroyed their peace, shamed her publicly, and seen Isaiah taken away like a common criminal. For a long moment after they were gone, Eliza did not move. The instinct to run, the instinct that had guided her for so long, screamed at her. She could pack her small valise and disappear, leave Dustwater and this whole sorry mess behind. But then she thought of Isaiah, sitting in a cold cell, his freedom sacrificed for her. She thought of his quiet kindness, of his hand in hers as they walked out of the church, of his lips on hers in the heart of the storm. He had stood for her. Now she had to stand for him. Her decision made, she did not run. She walked back into Dustwater, her steps firm and resolute. She did not go to the jail. She went to the center of town, to the wide, dusty street, in front of the general store, where a small crowd had already gathered. Drawn by the news of the arrest, their faces a mixture of fear and morbid curiosity. She saw Mrs. Caldwell there, her face alight with vindicated judgment. She saw Mrs. Murphy, her expression full of worry. She saw the faces of the men and women who had whispered and stared. This was her audience. This was her jury. She stopped in the middle of the street and waited until all eyes were on her. She took a deep breath, and when she spoke, her voice was not the timid whisper of a victim. It was clear and strong, and it carried in the still afternoon air. "You all saw the sheriff take Isaiah Doone to jail," she began, her gaze sweeping over the crowd. "You heard that he attacked Tom Harlan, And I'm sure you are all telling yourselves that this is what happens when a decent town allows a fallen woman to live in its midst. A murmur went through the crowd. She had spoken their thoughts aloud. "But you do not know the truth," she continued, her voice rising with passion. "You see a recluse and a powerful rancher, but I see something else. I see the man who harassed me in Kansas, who made my life so unbearable that I had to flee with nothing but the clothes on my back. I came here looking for peace, for an honest wage at the double bar, not knowing it was his." She pointed a trembling finger in the direction of Harlan's ranch. "That is the man I was running from, and today he found me. He came to the small home where I have been living, a home that was given to me out of kindness when this town would have let me sleep in the street. And he slandered me. He called me vile names. He said I was trading my body for shelter. He took the decency of a good man and twisted it into something filthy and shameful, all to soothe his own wounded pride." She turned her gaze on Mrs. Caldwell, her eyes blazing. "You, madam, you were the first to judge me. You and so many others. You have whispered that I am a woman of no morals. But I ask all of you, what are morals? Is it moral for a rich man to use his power to torment a woman who will not have him? Is it moral to use words to tear down a person's reputation? Or is it moral to offer food and a warm bed to a stranger in need, and ask for nothing in return?" Tears were streaming down her face now, but she did not wipe them away. They were tears of anger, not of sorrow. Isaiah Doone did not disturb the peace. The peace was disturbed the moment Tom Harlan rode onto his land with poison in his heart. Isaiah did not strike a man without provocation. He defended a woman who could not defend herself. He did what any decent man, what any honorable man would have done. The law says he committed a crime, but I say he performed an act of justice. She stood in the middle of the street, her small frame trembling with the force of her words, her challenge hanging in the air. "That is the truth. Now, you have to decide what a town like Dustwater does with the truth." When Eliza's voice finally fell silent, the street was held in a profound, ringing stillness. The wind, which always seemed to be moving in Dustwater, held its breath. Her words, raw and true, had landed in the heart of the assembled crowd and detonated, shattering the lazy afternoon and the town's comfortable, cruel assumptions. For a long moment, no one moved. They were a tableau of stunned faces, caught between the woman who had laid her soul bare and the comfortable lies they had been telling themselves. The first to break the spell was Mrs. Murphy. She stepped out from the crowd, her kind, tired face set with a look of fierce determination. She walked to where Eliza stood trembling, her speech having taken every last ounce of her strength, and put a work-roughened hand on her arm. "She is telling the truth, Mrs." Murphy said, her voice clear and steady. "A challenge to anyone who would doubt it. I took this woman in when she had nothing, and I have seen her character. There is more Christian decency in her little finger than Tom Harlan has in his entire overfed body." A low murmur went through the crowd. It was a sound of shifting allegiances, of minds beginning to change. Then another voice, rough and deep, cut through the air. It was Big Pete, the saloon owner, a man not known for his delicate sensibilities. He stood on the saloon porch, wiping a glass with a dirty rag. "I never liked Harlan," he stated, as if it were a simple, indisputable fact. "He acts like he owns the world, but he pays his bills slow and treats his men like dirt. The woman has got the right of it. Doone was defending his home. Any man here would have done the same." That was the crack in the dam, the sentiment, once spoken aloud by two respected, if very different, members of the community, began to flow through the crowd. Men who had known Isaiah for years, who had seen his quiet, unobtrusive grief and respected his privacy, began to nod in agreement. Women who had whispered about Eliza now looked at her with a new understanding, seeing not a fallen woman, but a survivor, a woman of unexpected and formidable strength. They saw the reflection of their own struggles in her defiance, their own desire for dignity in her plea for justice. The collective gaze of the town turned on Mrs. Caldwell, who stood frozen, her face a mask of pinched fury. She had been the general of this campaign of slander, and now she found her army deserting her. Her judgment, once the unassailable law of the town's respectable society, now looked like what it was, the petty, spiteful cruelty of a bitter woman. She opened her mouth to speak, to rally her forces, but no words came out. She was met with a wall of cold, disapproving stares. For the first time, Mrs. Caldwell was the one being judged, and she could not bear the scrutiny. With a strangled sound of outrage, she turned and marched back into her boarding house, slamming the door behind her. Her reign was over. The crowd, now a community with a shared purpose, began to move toward the sheriff's office. It was not a mob, but a delegation. The sheriff, seeing the determined faces of his constituents, knew that the political winds had changed. He was a simple man who wanted a quiet life, and a quiet life meant keeping the town happy. An hour later, the door to the small jailhouse opened, and Isaiah Doone stepped out into the late afternoon sun. Eliza was waiting for him. She had not moved from her spot in the middle of the street. He stopped when he saw her, blinking in the bright light, his face pale from his short confinement, his wrists still bearing the faint red marks from the ropes. They looked at each other across the dusty ground, and in that single, silent gaze, 1,000 things were said. He saw her courage, her fierce loyalty, the incredible things she had done for him. She saw his quiet strength, his relief, and the deep, abiding tenderness in his eyes that was meant only for her. He walked to her, and they turned and began the long walk back to the cabin, the townspeople watching them go, not with suspicion, but with a quiet, solemn respect. They did not speak, they did not touch, but they walked in perfect step. Two people who had faced the world together and won. Tom Harlan did not leave town immediately, but his defeat was absolute. His power had been built on a foundation of money and intimidation, and Eliza's words had exposed him as nothing more than a bully and a coward. Men who had once sought his favor now avoided his gaze, his ranch hands, no longer willing to work for a man who had been so thoroughly shamed, began to drift away. His plans for a new freight line were dead. He was a king without a kingdom. A week after Isaiah's release, he was gone, his magnificent black horse pulling a wagon loaded with his possessions. His departure, as unceremonious as his arrival, had been grand. He did not look back. Spring settled over Dustwater, and with it came a sense of renewal, not just for the land, but for its people. Eliza's act of courage had changed the town's chemistry. The hard shell of suspicion and judgment had been cracked, and a new, more compassionate spirit had begun to emerge. The women who had once shunned her now sought her out, bringing her their mending, their conversations no longer filled with gossip, but with the shared stories of their hard-won lives. With Mrs. Murphy's help, Eliza rented a small, sunlit room attached to the general store and opened a proper sewing shop. The small, hand-painted sign, Eliza Monroe, seamstress, was a declaration of her independence, a testament to the fact that she had not just found a place in Dustwater, but had made one for herself. Isaiah, too, began to re-engage with the world. The ghosts that had held him captive for so long had not vanished, but they no longer had the power to paralyze him. He began to take on small freight jobs, hauling supplies for the miners in the nearby hills, his old skills returning to him as if they had only been sleeping. He was still a man of few words, but the deep, settled sorrow in him had been replaced by a quiet sense of purpose. He was no longer just existing. He was living again. One morning, Eliza awoke to a new sound, the rhythmic thud of an axe biting into wood. She looked out the window and saw Isaiah felling a tall pine tree at the edge of his property. All that day, and for many days after, the air was filled with the sounds of his labor, the scrape of a saw, the clean strike of a hammer, the scent of fresh-cut lumber. He was building something. On the west side of the cabin, a new room began to take shape, a small but sturdy structure with its own window that looked out over the vast, open prairie. He worked with a quiet, focused intensity, his movements sure and economical. Eliza would bring him water in the heat of the day, and they would stand together for a few moments, not speaking, just watching the new walls rise. She knew he was building it for her, though he never said as much. It was his way of telling her that this was no longer a temporary arrangement, a place of refuge. This was a home they were building together. Finally, the day came when the room was finished. It was simple and clean, the new pine boards filling the air with their sharp, clean scent. He had built a small bed frame for it, and a chest for her belongings. It was a space that was entirely her own, a tangible symbol of his respect for her, a fulfillment of a promise he had never explicitly made. That evening, after they had eaten their supper, they stood in the doorway between the old part of the cabin and the new. The setting sun filled the new room with a warm, golden light. "It is a beautiful room, Isaiah," Eliza said, her voice soft with an emotion she could not name. He nodded, his gaze on the setting sun. "It will be yours," he said simply. "Her room." Eliza was silent for a moment, a slow, playful smile touching her lips for the first time in what felt like an eternity. She turned to him, her eyes dancing in the lamplight. "Where should I sleep now, Mr. Doone?" she asked, her voice a low, teasing murmur, a gentle echo of their formal, cautious beginnings. A smile touched Isaiah's own lips, a rare and wonderful thing that transformed his stark, somber face, making him look younger, freer. He did not answer her with words. Instead, he turned and walked to the bed in the main room, the bed that had once been his alone, the bed that had been her refuge on that first, desperate night. He reached down and took a corner of the familiar, worn blanket, the same blanket he had pulled back for her all those months ago. He drew it back, revealing the clean, patched sheets beneath. He looked at her then, his pale eyes full of a love that was as vast and as quiet as the prairie itself, a love that had been forged in loneliness and hardship, in silence and in storms. His voice, when he spoke, was a low, gentle rumble, a sound that was no longer just an offer of shelter, but an invitation to a shared life, a final, profound declaration of home. Right here. A year passed, the seasons turned, and the unforgiving land that had been the backdrop for so much hardship and heartache began to show a gentler face. But the land was not the only thing that had changed. Dustwater itself had undergone a quiet transformation, a slow, seismic shift in its very soul. The harsh, judgmental spirit that had once held sway had receded, like a bitter frost melting in the spring sun, replaced by something warmer, something more resilient, something that felt a little like hope. The change was visible on the main street. The Caldwell boarding house now had a new sign, reading simply, "The Traveler's Rest," and the new owners, a cheerful couple from the east, kept the front door propped open on warm days. The whispers that had once followed Eliza like a shadow had been replaced by friendly greetings. She was no longer Eliza Monroe, the fallen woman, the town enigma. She was Eliza, the seamstress. Her small shop, with its bright, clean window and the sign she had painted herself, had become a center of the town's female society. It was more than a place to have a dress mended or a new shirt made. It was a place where women gathered to share news, to seek advice, to drink a cup of coffee and rest for a moment from the endless, grinding work of their lives. Eliza, who had arrived in Dustwater with nothing but a desperate hope, had become a respected and beloved part of the community she had once fought so hard just to survive in. She had found her place not by running, but by standing still. Isaiah, too, had found his way back into the world of the living. He had taken the money he had saved over his long years of solitude and had bought a sturdy wagon and a team of strong mules. The sign on the side of his wagon was as simple and direct as the man himself. Dune transport. He was a freight hauler again. He ran supplies to the outlying ranches and mining camps, his knowledge of the treacherous roads and the fickle weather making him reliable and sought after. He was still a quiet man, his words carefully chosen, but the heavy, oppressive silence that had once clung to him like a shroud was gone. He now met the eyes of the men he did business with. His handshake was firm, his dealings fair. They saw in him not the town hermit, the tragic figure from a half-forgotten story, but a man of his word, a man you could count on. The ghosts of Devil's Canyon had not vanished, but they no longer drove him. They walked beside him now, a quiet, sad part of his history, but they did not steer his course. He was his own man again. Their home had changed as well. The small, stark cabin was now a proper house. The new room, her room, was no longer a separate addition but an integrated part of their shared life. The door between the two spaces was always open. His gun rack and tools were on one wall, her sewing basket and bolts of cloth on another. It was a space that held both of them, a perfect fusion of their two lives. In the corner, the small, dust-covered rocking chair was gone. In its place stood a sturdy bookshelf Isaiah had built, filled with a handful of books they owned and the new ones he would sometimes bring her from his trips to the larger towns. The tiny, button-up shoes, Mary's shoes, were not hidden away. They sat on the mantel of the fireplace, clean and polished, a small, sad, and beautiful memorial to a life that had been loved and was not forgotten. Eliza had placed them there one evening, and when Isaiah had seen them, he had said nothing, but had simply reached out and taken her hand, his thumb stroking the back of it in a gesture of silent, profound gratitude. He was no longer running from his past, and so he was finally free to build a future. Their love had settled, like the land itself, into a deep and quiet rhythm. It was not a thing of grand pronouncements, but of 1,000 small, daily gestures of care. It was in the way she would have a hot meal waiting for him when he returned, weary and dust-covered, from a long trip. It was in the way he would leave a small, brightly colored wildflower he had found on the trail on her sewing table. It was in the comfortable silence they shared in the evenings, sitting by the fire, her hands busy with her needlework, his with a piece of wood he was carving into the shape of a bird. It was a love that did not need words, for it was spoken in every shared glance, every gentle touch, every beat of their two hearts, which had found, in each other, a place to finally rest. One evening in the late summer, they stood together on the porch of their home, watching the sun set over the prairie. The sky was a vast, magnificent canvas of bruised purple and fiery orange, the colors so intense they seemed to be singing. A cool breeze whispered through the tall grass, carrying the scent of dust and distant rain. The world was settling into a deep, peaceful hush. Isaiah had returned that afternoon from a 3-day trip, and he stood beside her now, his arm wrapped around her shoulders, holding her close. She leaned her head against him, feeling the steady, solid strength of him, a strength that had become her anchor in the world. He was no longer the broken, silent man she had met in a lonely diner. He was a man made whole, a man who had found his way back from the brink not through forgetting, but through the difficult, courageous act of remembering and choosing to live anyway. And she was no longer the desperate, frightened widow who had been turned away from every door. She was a woman who had found her own strength, her own voice, and in doing so, had helped to heal not only a man, but an entire town. They stood like that for a long time, watching the last sliver of the sun disappear below the horizon, leaving the world bathed in the soft, lavender light of twilight. The first stars began to appear, faint diamonds scattered on a cloth of deepening blue. The quiet of the prairie was absolute, a perfect, profound peace. Eliza tilted her head back to look at him, her heart so full of a quiet, powerful love that it felt as if it might burst. She thought of that first, terrible night, of her utter despair, of the simple, unexpected act of kindness that had changed the course of her life. She thought of the long, cold winter, of the whispers and the stares, of the battles they had fought, both within themselves and with the world outside. She thought of how far they had come. "Home is not a place," she said, her voice a soft murmur, barely disturbing the stillness of the evening. Isaiah looked down at her, his pale eyes glowing in the twilight, filled with a love so deep and certain it took her breath away. He finished her thought as if it were his own. Their two minds, their two hearts, beating as one. It is a person who will not let you face the cold alone. They turned and walked back into the house, into the warm, steady light of the home they had built together. They closed the door on the darkness, on the vast and lonely plains, and in the quiet heart of their small cabin. Two souls who had been lost in the wilderness of their own grief, finally, and forever, found their way. The night was deep and peaceful, and when the first pale fingers of dawn stretched across the eastern sky, they met the new day not as two separate people, but as one. Their faces turned toward the rising sun, ready for the life that was waiting for them, a life that had been born not in the light, but in the long, dark night they had survived together. Thank you for listening to our story. Please comment below where you are listening from so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And remember to subscribe to our channel Wild West Night, like the video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.